Fine, we'll put on a banner next time.
Okay.
Okay, we are live. Okay, let me. We're over here. We're starting the first podcast, the first webcast for this episode called Property Protection, Protecting Property. And it's really about two things. Number one, understanding what we're dealing with in the property before anything should happen so that hopefully we don't have any damages. And then once something does happen, what to do about it. So today we have Ken Larsen, who's really an expert when it comes to understanding the concept of drying and really putting together a plan of action to getting it back to where it was pre-loss condition. Ken Larsen is the author of a book that's called Leadership to Restoration Drying. I was looking into the book and I'm like, well, this is the fourth edition, not just the first. So I know there's been a lot of change over the last while to get to where you are today. And it's really changed the dynamics, I'm sure, of how you think when you look at things. So Ken, where did you grow up? Let's start from there.
Yeah, okay. Let's start at the beginning. So I started in this industry in 1978 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. My father had a cleaning and restoration company in Calgary, and I was a 17-year-old kid and needed to have some work after school, so I would help my father out, and it ended up that I was employed by him for a few years. I then got married and moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and lived there for 20 years with my own company. I had my own restoration firm there for 20 years, and that's how I started in the business. So I've been doing it since 1978, so I'm about 4.5 decades into this. And during that time, I've owned my own restoration firms. I then sold my business in the year 1997 to my business partner at the time. And I then married an American and moved down to the United States. So I lived in California for 3 years, working in the environmental consulting world. For an environmental consulting firm. This was when mold was just starting to get, the industry was starting to pay attention to mold and the potential health impact of ingesting mold or being exposed to moldy environments. And so it was very interesting at the time. Everybody was fascinated in how to research this and how to establish, what the risks are associated with mold. So I did that for a few years in Sacramento, and then 3 years later, I moved to Seattle. Just outside of Seattle, there's a town called Burlington, and that's where DryEase Products makes their dehumidifiers and air movers. And so they were looking for an instructor. And so they asked me if I'd be interested in being an instructor for them. And so I was there for 3 years or so. Then I took an opportunity with a company called BMS Catastrophe, Blackman Mooring Schematic. And I was one of their, I was the person that was in charge of keeping track of all of their drying assets, the equipment necessary to dry large buildings after they had become wet. And so I was managing about 3.5 million cubic feet per minute of desiccant technology, about 10 or 15,000 LGRs, that's low grain refrigerant dehumidifiers, and then about 30,000 air movers. And so I had to know where they all were at any given time and who had them and were they being built. So I did that for a period of time. I then got hired by a company called Disaster Cleanup International, DKI Corporate. Now they were a franchise, or are a franchise, they still exist. And they had about 500 or so members in their network of restoration contractors. And so I was their director of education for about 7 or 8 years. And I then acquired their school because they decided they didn't need to have a school anymore. So I acquired that and carried on with that school and continue to teach to this day. For the most part, though, my focus is heavily slanted towards the consulting side of restoration work, more helping contractors and actually any materially interested entity. It could be the homeowner, the contractor, or the insurer who need to have some guidance or opinion on how to approach a job or the appropriateness of how a contractor approached the job. So I'm heavily involved in that. And in particular, the focus that I'm really putting my attention towards is establishing the category of the water, establishing if it is fresh water or significantly contaminated or grossly contaminated. And so I will conduct the inspection and testing to establish, just how soiled that water that got into the building was, because if it absorbed into the building products, you can't get that out. So you gotta remove and replace those materials that have absorbed the water. And it's an incredibly important part of restoration decision making. You see, many people want to dispute the action of either restoring or replacing any of these items. You can be wrong either way if you don't categorize it right. And so if people who want to argue can say, I don't care which way you went, you didn't prove that it was this contaminated or not contaminated. So that's what my focus is. I'm as a third party, I am hired by the policyholder. That's, whoever's got the property, and I will provide them with the report so that they can present it to the contractor and their adjuster and say, this independent study found that the water is or is not clean. Therefore, the scope of work becomes much less debatable. And so that's my focus in my career right now.
Interesting. So I'm hearing a lot of jumping around, but a lot of real focus in the industry where you've really got such a broad picture of every single type of way of looking at the items that need to be properly dried, and then actually taking control over everything and really becoming the experts in the drying space and really understanding of what it takes to get rid of the categories of water, the water, and just as important, recognizing what category that is so that we can go ahead and then dry it properly to get it to where it is. Right. And what I'm hearing from you is the priority, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I understand that documentation is the key to any outcome when it comes to insurance claims. And really, as the key documentation, we have to properly test and understand what the category of water is that we're looking at, so that then we know how to respond and how to create a plan of action to take care of the water. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And in today's marketplace in the insurance industry, it's a very tricky landscape, especially today, more so than it's ever been. After doing this for more than 4 decades, I've seen it go from its very beginnings when people were just learning how to dry out buildings. You see, before this industry of drying out wet buildings existed, that would be before 1970 or so. When you had a water intrusion into your house, the contractor would come in there and just start cutting everything out. There was no attempt to dry things. What you would do is you would go in and you'd cut out the carpet, you'd cut out the pad, you'd cut out the sheetrock, you'd cut out everything. If it was wet, you cut it out. And then you're going to think I'm nuts. You would simply open up the windows and doors and let it sit like that for a few days. And then, the contractor would put everything back together. That was restoration back in the day. Now, in the 70s, they started to realize that if it was clean water, there's really no reason why you can't dry out many of those materials. When you think of carpet, when you clean carpet, they're using hot water soil extraction methods. They're spraying water into the carpet, sucking it out, and then drying it. Well, I guess it's okay if it got wet. You just got to dry it quickly. So there are ways and tools that you can use to dry out these materials and have no adverse consequence to it. Now, the insurance industry, when we started doing that, they paid attention. We're like, this is great. We're going to, be able to reduce loss severity. It won't cost so much to repair these buildings now. And so we started to really focus on drying out many of the buildings that we encountered. Eventually, though, some of the contractors out there, they started to abuse some trusts. with these insurance carriers and started to dry things that were then replaced afterwards, but then collected on both the drying effort and the replacement effort. That's double dipping. Where's the value in that, right? And so they ended up questioning some of these invoices. And so here we are 4 decades later, and I guess the distrust has evolved, and it has become a difficult landscape to navigate, especially if you're a policyholder who's just making the claim on their own. If you don't have assistance, if you're not surrounded by people that really know how this is going to play out, you can find yourself in an awkward position where you might not be receiving the full value that you are owed. So it's good to have assistance in your insurance claims.
Understood. So really at the end of the day is that category of water makes a difference, and we can't just come in and just open up the windows. And I know a lot of times when there's a major hurricane, they say, well, there's no access to any equipment. They say just open the windows. And that is a good technique to at least get the thing started, but that doesn't always resolve the issue of actually getting it to fully dry. That's just a starting point when there's no other option.
When there's no other option. So here's the thing with that. So opening up the windows and doors, depending on where you are geographically, that might be a good idea. It might be a really bad idea. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I live in Tampa, Florida. And right now, the humidity, I am not exaggerating. I have a little thermometer outside with a very accurate humidity gauge on it. And I'm always fascinated by what's happening with the humidity levels inside and outside a building. This morning, yesterday was worse. Yesterday it was 84 degrees Fahrenheit at 7 in the morning. So it's hot, very hot, first thing in the morning, right?
The sun hasn't even lifted yet.
I know, and it was 98% relative humidity. Now imagine being that hot and quite literally saturated air. When you walk outside, my pajamas, because I sat outside to have my coffee, my pajamas and my skin were colder than the dew point temperature outside. So the minute I stepped outside, all my clothes, condensed water. I am instantly drenched. All my clothes are soaking wet. Happens in about 3 seconds. And you sit there and you pick this out like, why am I soaking wet? Where did that come from? It's because of the humidity. Now imagine that you've got your house that has water that just came in, and you made the decision to open the windows and doors to that air outside. I'll tell you what's going to happen. I've literally done this myself, where you open the doors and windows outside when it's Florida outside. The inside of my building was the temperature I had my air conditioning on. It was set for 75 degrees Fahrenheit. That is colder than the dew point temperature outside. And within seconds, everything in your house, I mean everything, the ceiling, the furniture, your bedding, all your clothes in your closet, everything gets soaking wet. Like, I mean dripping wet instantly, because it condensed the water that you let in from outside. It can be a devastating decision to open up windows and doors depending on where you are. Okay, so it's not like a blanket statement. It's always good to open your windows and doors. Sometimes it can cause way more damage in seconds, and you would do it innocently.
What I'm hearing is also it makes a difference inside the house if the AC was on, or if you lost electricity and now suddenly the dew point in the house is the same like outside, then it's not as relevant. But it could once again still affect everything.
That's right. You were correct when you said that. Yeah. So it depends on what the atmospheric conditions are inside and outside before that decision should be made. And so this is the value in having someone like myself who understands this science, or yourself who is familiar with it, to come in and help with that decision-making process, and then guide the homeowner in wise decisions that are scientifically supportable, and that can actually be a benefit to the restoration of the structure rather than its demise, right?
Understood. And you mentioned about myself coming in, or yourself. And the way I look at this is when, as a public adjuster, when we get involved in these properties, we know when to ask questions. So we may not have the answers, but we know that 1 second, this is something that I need to call you on. I need to call Ken Larsen to really understand the full grasp of the situation, because there's a question here that needs to be answered. Having gone through that, and I know you've written the book, and that's really changes a lot of people's understanding to what and how to look at these things. Understanding that book, can we go through some of the dynamics that you talk about? I mean, for example, the rate of evaporation. What really dictates the rate of evaporation. I know we spoke about the difference in dew point. Are there other things that you would mention along this understanding of how the dynamics evaporate? How does the air get pulled out from?
How does the water get pulled out of the air? Yeah, and how do you get the water out of the materials?
Yes.
This is a really good question. And if I may, I'd like to just start by saying what inspired me to write this monstrous book. I mean, it's, whoops, I'm going to see if I can, yeah, see, it's a monstrous book. It's 530 pages long, and you can barely see it. There it is. Okay, you got it now. So in this book, what inspired me to write it, there was several things. I will say that there's no library books on this subject. It's time we get a library book on this subject. So I decided to write it, all right? And so this is found in libraries. It's used in universities as a textbook for those who wish to get a degree in construction management with a focus on disaster response. Purdue University offers that option. There's a certification organization. There's a couple of them in our industry. The one that's most commonly known is IICRC, the Institute of Inspection in Cleaning and Restoration Certification, and the ACAC, the American Council for Accredited Certification, and the RIA, the Restoration Industry Association. So they all have mentioned this book as recommended reading material if you wish to focus on this specialty service of drying out water damaged buildings. So the reason why I wrote this book was I was inspired by some of the incorrect teachings being taught by some of the certification organizations. It's important that if you're a restorer, that you understand how the learning objectives in those courses are established. They have a committee that will consider many subjects that should be presented in a classroom setting for the student who wishes to get their water restoration technician education or some other water damage related activity. So this committee of anywhere from a half dozen to a dozen people will be sitting in a room and discussing ideas on how to dry out a building. And frankly, like I said, there's no library books on the subject. So they're going on their experience and their best judgment. So I don't think anybody on the committees are malicious in any way. I don't think that they do this intentionally, but some of their ideas have no scientific merit. They are conflicted in university textbooks, chemistry books, even dictionaries. The IICRC creates word definitions that are specific. They do have known definitions. I'll give you an example. Relative humidity has a definition. It's not something that we need to redefine or guess at. So when the IICRC in their exams, they say, what is the definition of relative humidity? Yeah, we should know what that is, especially if you're a water damage expert, right? So don't you think that definition should be commonly found in something like a dictionary or a chemistry textbook or a physics textbook or some other authoritative source? But that's not how the committee establishes their understandings. What they do is they propose a definition and then they vote on it. And the majority will get a majority vote will get the new definition that they just conjured up among themselves, and it will be included as an exam question. I have a problem with that because that's not the way physics work. It's not something that a committee of restoration contractors can guess at, and then it becomes a valid exam question. That's just not the way it works. So I decided somebody's got to do the research and establish some source that has validated content. And so I decided to write this book. Now, it took me years. It took me about 5 years, maybe a little bit more, to assemble this 530-page document. And I researched everything from how evaporation happens, what the roles are of the equipment, how do you determine what an effective drying plan is. That's one of my biggest beefs in this industry right now, is that so few contractors, if any, and I hate to say it so emphatically, I know it's kind of a sweeping comment, but I would be very, very surprised to see any of these restoration contractors out there actually have a written drying plan before they start the job. And it frustrates me, because without a drying plan, all you are is you're an equipment delivery service, because you have no plan. You're just dropping off equipment and you're waiting for your moisture meters to stop beeping when you place it on any of the materials inside the house. Well, that's not a drying plan. That's passively just watching to see how the house will dry. And it's not evidence that your process worked. Look, I know I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole here, but this is an important understanding. I think most of us understand that if you had a wet house and you left it alone, it would eventually dry out. Eventually it will. Now, it'll probably be a moldy nightmare, but it will eventually become satisfactorily in a dry condition, even though it's moldy and rotten and ruined. So the point on that is that houses dry on their own. The point, though, that the reason why we're hired is to dry it so quickly that the building materials don't go nasty and rot and go moldy. So how do we prove that our system did a better job than what Mother Nature would do? How do you prove that? That's a great question, right? In order to do that, you need to have a plan and prove that you created the drying forces necessary to meet your desired goals, and validate that your equipment is what caused that. Right? Now, that's a proof that your system was validated and necessary and justifiable. And in the absence of that, then you're just guessing and you're hoping that the consumer is well, they have no idea if you did a job that was better than what Mother Nature would have done. And so that all these types of things, that all contributed to why I wrote this book and explained exactly how you make water that's trapped inside some building material decide to become a gas and leave that building material. What is it that actually makes that water molecule decide to take a vapor phase? That's a great question, right? And so this book studies deep into that process. And what I will tell your guests that are watching this, what they need to know is that it is not the equipment that dries the building. It is the contractor's skill with their equipment that dries the building. So I'll give you an example. I like to use this in a classroom setting. Us guys, we kind of like tools, all right? We like those big red tool boxes where you have those drawers that you can slide out, and it's got all your chrome wrenches and tools and screwdrivers that are in there. It looks beautiful, right? And it'll have your favorite brand of tools that are on there. It might be Craftsman or Snap-on or whatever it might be, right? And we love those toolboxes. Imagine you had a 6-foot toolbox. How much money could you spend filling that toolbox with your favorite brand of tools? The answer is $50,000 to $100,000 you can spend just filling that toolbox up with the best tools that money can buy. So imagine you had all that money. You went out and bought this toolbox. You bring the toolbox back to your house. You park that toolbox right there in the front of the garage, and then you bring your car in and you park it 2 feet away from your toolbox. Then you go inside the house and you sleep for the night. When you come out in the morning, is your car fixed?
Absolutely not.
It's not fixed. But you spent $100,000 on the best tools that money can buy. Why isn't your car fixed? It's because it's not the tool that fixes the car. It's the mechanic and their skill with the tools that will produce the desired results. And it's the same thing when you're drying out a building. It is not the dehumidifier. It is not the air mover. It's not the water extraction unit that was brought in on the job that produces the acceptably dried building. It's not the tools. It's the mechanic and their skill with their tools that will produce the dry building. And this is why this book can be so valuable, is because it explains how to use your tools effectively and what they do to inspire that water molecule to become a gas. Right? And so this is the big light bulb moment for many restorers out there, is that we are not an equipment delivery service. That is not what dries the building. We are not all the same. We are not a commodity. We have different skill sets and different actually different approaches to how to dry a building. And so it's important that we understand the physics behind making materials dry rather than just looking at the tools. And I apologize for the long-winded discussion here, but once in a while I'll get really enthused about something.
That's fine. And I know we've met on claims. We've sat down, we've met, and we're dealing with now with a phenomenal project that I'm not going to go into too many details over here, but the house was created by Thomas Edison, and it's a phenomenal project. And and you say, we always have different opinions. And what I like is when we sit down and we have a conversation, we end up as a resolution. We're together. We're satisfied with the end result. When we look at different things and we're handling different type of products, I understand that there's something that very often is forgotten called the stabilization stage.
Yeah.
Can you go into detail why stabilization stage is important? I mean, I know, yes, the insurance company has to be presented with the ability to inspect, but why is stabilization important? And what's the difference when it comes to certain issues? I mean, like in the case where we have asbestos, lead, and other type of things that we're suddenly looking at, now we can't really jump in and just start ripping the walls out, right? What are we supposed to be looking at, and how does stabilization really take effect?
So we could. I mean, back in the day, that's exactly what we did. We would walk into we would have the policy holder sign one of our agreements, and then we'd get to work and we would do what we knew had to be done. Sometimes you have to remove baseboards, and sometimes you have to remove the carpet cushion and dispose of that. And you just begin getting in there and doing what needs to be done. And we would take a few photographs, It's not like today where you have digital photographs and the file. It's not uncommon for a file to contain hundreds or even thousands of photographs documenting the restoration approach. But back in the day, we would just go in there and start doing what we need to do. The insurance companies started to realize that, hey, now wait a minute. Some of these contractors are taking out things like a kitchen, disassembling an entire kitchen, getting all the cabinetry out of there. And that's a very expensive repair. And they were doing that needlessly and thus incurring a cost to the insurance company that is questionable, right? So insurers started to really dig in their heels and say, quit doing things so quickly. And they drew attention to language that is in the policy that says that the policyholder must give the insurance company the right to inspect the damages. And they started to enforce that. If the contractor started taking apart the building, they did not give the insurance company the right to inspect. And so they would get mad and say, I'm sorry, you got no claim. The claim is spoiled because the contractor did too much work before the insurance company had the right to inspect. Well, the contractors started to really pay attention to that because all of a sudden they weren't getting paid on some of these claims. So they decided, okay, we're going to honor that language that exists in their policy, and we are going to, we know that we got the policyholder to sign our agreement. We are officially engaged, the contractor says. And they will go in there and they say, boy, there's a lot of wet materials here. Nobody's questioning that. But we have to give the insurance company the right to inspect. So I'll tell you what.
Sorry
there you go. That's for you. That's the wife. She
That's
wants you to pick up
Michael's.
some butter and some milk on the way home, right?
Yeah, I silenced the phone, but the alarm still rings.
I better make sure mine wasn't even silenced, so I'm gonna make sure mine's done too. Okay. So what happens is the contractor says there's a lot of wet materials in this building, but we have to wait for the insurance company to come by and take a look. So in order to keep the wet materials from increasing the humidity levels in the house so high, because they're going to evaporate a little bit, and the humidity levels, if that's not managed, it's going to end up soaking into unaffected materials. And then the unaffected materials now become part of the scope of repairs, even though they were never in physical contact with the liquid, the original liquid that came into the house. So there's we refer to the liquid as primary damage. Anything that the liquid water physically comes into contact with, that's primary damage. If that liquid starts to evaporate and soak into unaffected materials and make them excessively wet simply because the humidity levels were so high in the house, that's referred to as secondary damage. It is any damage that occurs due to the atmosphere being too humid, not managed. So the contractor will initiate controls to keep the unaffected materials from becoming excessively wet due to high humidity. That is called stabilization, all right? And it's poorly understood in our industry right now. Many contractors are installing drying strategies and then calling it stabilization. It's not the same. They are not even close to the same. Here's some of the differences. In a stabilization strategy, there's no air movers, none, no air movers. It's not justifiable. You are not there to blow air over the surfaces of wet materials, especially if it's contaminated water, blowing that contaminant all over the house, because if it goes onto little Billy's pillow, you know, that contaminant, and your air mover moved it over there, that's on the contractor. And that happens. That's not a good day, right? So no air movers in a stabilization strategy. You do want to control the humidity though, right? Because all the wet materials are evaporating some of that water. So how dry does the air need to be? Does it need to be super dry, just like a drying strategy would be? No, because we're just trying to keep it normal, safe, healthy, comfortable. That's a stabilization strategy. It is not an industrial drying strategy. So what does normal, healthy, safe, and comfortable look like? Well, the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, ASHRAE, states that a normal, safe, comfortable, healthy living environment is between the temperature of 60 to 80 Fahrenheit. So temperature is part of that consideration, all right? And you would bring in supplemental heaters or no, I want to choose the correct word. It's not supplemental. We're not supplementing anything that's running. It's portable. Portable heating or cooling systems. Okay, and that says temporary because you have to, especially in a contaminated environment, you must isolate the HVAC system from your affected area. So you're gonna have to set up chambers. You know, if it's all contaminated water in there, you must isolate the heating and air conditioning system of the house so that the dirty air doesn't get distributed throughout the house, right? So that means you have to have portable controls to manage the temperature. So 60 to 80, that's normal. 70 degrees is very normal. Let's go to the humidity levels. What's normal humidity? ASHRAE says between 30 and 55% relative humidity. Now, 30% relative humidity is pretty darn dry in most areas, all right? So we're not trying to dry things, remember? Our objective is to be comfortable, healthy, normal, right? Safe. So if you had 50% relative humidity, you're in the zone of meeting that criteria. So we suggest keeping the relative humidity between 45 and 50% relative humidity at a temperature range between 60 and 80 Fahrenheit. That is a lousy drying condition. but we're not there to dry things. We're there just to keep unaffected materials from becoming excessively wet by high humidity. And so that's what we would install. And it's you would document that you kept that your equipment produced that environmental condition inside that window. That's a stabilization strategy. One more component is appropriate, and that would be an air filtration device, a HEPA air scrubber. Now, the reason why that would be appropriate is because if it is contaminated water, then you want to make sure that any of the dust that happens to become airborne is not being transferred elsewhere in the structure. So HEPA filtration is normal and usual and customary in a stabilization strategy. So while I have all these specifications and I'm describing stabilization in this fashion, you should know that in our industry standard called the S500 in section 12.3.5, I believe, okay, it states in there, there's a section in there that speaks about stabilization with these objectives in mind, not the thresholds, but the objectives. And so this is how we recommend you abide by those objectives.
So from what I'm hearing, when it comes to drying, it's really about stopping the growth of damaged water, basically, of the damages to really expanding. So we're trying to reduce it by stabilizing it so that the dew points and the moisture is not changing, not circulating around. So we're keeping the temperature to where it is. We're keeping the dew point, we're keeping that moisture to where it is just to prevent it from growing, and that's it. And we're also cleaning the air, that anything that does move, once again, mildly cleaning the air so that we're using the proper HEPA vacuum, HEPA filtration to prevent that from really circulating throughout the place and getting around.
Absolutely, and you said that so eloquently. It's a very complicated scientific discussion, and it can be difficult to follow sometimes. But yeah, you're right on.
It becomes so simple. You know, as you've laid out, and as you're laying out with the factor of your book, it becomes so simple when you simply understand the background of why we're doing what we're doing. And when we understand that, it becomes so simple. Something got wet. Now we have to stop it from growing. And yes, we want to rip out the damaged stuff. Not always do we need to rip it out. Sometimes, especially if it's category, if it's simple water, a lot of times we can just dry it out, as long as it's not going to grow mold, etc. But a lot of times it will, and it really is understanding it comes back to documentation is key for anything else we do, because we need to understand what the damages is and what the potential results are, and therefore how do we handle it accordingly.
That's right.
And that makes such a big difference when you're walking in. And, I know the first time I was on the phone with you and talking to you about the project we have, and it's like, okay, well, what category of water is it? And then we called in the hygienist, and we're going through all the reporting stages, and some things take forever. It's part of the fun of life. But, we try to move along as quickly as we can. And at the same time, we have to understand the dynamics of what it is, and then how do we move forward. And I called in All States Restoration in this case. And there's so many other companies out there. And the first question that's really has to be asked is there a plan of action, and who is the hygienist, and where are all these reports, so that we can then move forward appropriately. And it really makes a big difference when you have the right team in place to really take care of the job, because it results in proper documentation and proper results, where now we can get rid of things and move forward without an issue of mold, etc.
Yeah, this project that you and I are currently working on, without getting into too many details, it was a very interesting job. Now, I know a lot of people say, how hard can it be to figure out how contaminated the water is? The S500 has examples. It says that examples of category 2 water are this, right? And category 3, that's grossly contaminated. Here's some examples. This. Now, the problem with that, though, is that on the job you and I are working on, the source of water is not mentioned. So I'll give you some examples. Category 3 water is commonly, an example of that would be a hurricane or wind-driven, storm-related water. All right, that's category 3, grossly contaminated water. That's one of the examples they show. And they have some other ones, a sewer backup, the toilet backs up and all the contents of the toilet end up inside the building. And it's that's an ugly job, but that would be grossly contaminated. So now the question is, on this job that you and I are both working on, there were 6 sump pumps that failed. The power went out and the sumps backed up. How dirty is that water? I tell you what, man, there's going to be arguments on that one, because there's going to be somebody that says, oh, it was rainwater. It's fresh water. How bad can it be? It came into the house. No biggie. Just dry it out. And there are some very aggressive insurance claims representatives that will take that position. I've been down that road many times. And unless you test it, you can't win against their opinion. You're in an opinion war. And it doesn't work. Because it's just opinions. And the only way to beat an opinion war is with facts. And so you got to have that water tested. And interestingly, Penny, I don't want to say too much about that job, but I wasn't the one that tested it. I wanted to have somebody that was top of the top of the top of the top, that was a certified industrial hygienist. And he was one of the original writers of the S500. And at the risk of name dropping him, I am going to mention Mike McGinnis, Dr. Michael McGinnis. And he came out there and he tested that sump pump water. And for those listeners who are saying, oh man, I've done sump pump backups and they were just fresh water, I'll tell you, he found E. coli, coliforms, and gram-negative bacteria in there. They were absolutely as bad as the chunky water that backs up from your toilet. Now, how many jobs did they get into that opinion war with and say, and win, saying it's just fresh water? And the policyholder lived with that decision. Now, if that makes people uncomfortable, go like, wow, I'm not really happy that I was part of that discussion that resulted in something like that, then I hope that they learn from this discussion, because we sure did. When we looked at that water coming out of those sump pumps, we all kind of were like, wow, we really missed a dangerous situation here by identifying what was in that water. It was critically important that we ran those tests. And so that's why we're actively involved doing this. And I feel good at the end of the day when I can provide that kind of value to the policyholder.
Oh yeah, we're going through now in proper documentation, and it's unbelievable when you look at the reports, and it's so clear as to what happens. And we have we have David Sweet helping us on a variety of things. And yeah, I know I'm mentioning some names here, and it's when you have the top in the industry, you look at things so differently, because it's just, the facts talk for themselves. There's nothing for us to argue about, opinionate. Opinions are no longer relevant when you're talking facts. Right. And it really changes, the perspective of and the understanding of the elements at the end of the day as to what has to be done, because it's not a matter of opinion. Here's the fact, and this is the resulting requirement to go back to where you are, to, where it is. I want to take us to the other end of the conversation over here, and I know we got focused a little bit on what we're doing and how it's resulting in really understanding the importance of documentation and testing. But I know you mentioned in your book about freeze drying and about different type of elements. Let's talk drying as a whole. And before we go on, I just want to let our viewers understand that first of all, we appreciate you being here, and we can't see who's on the call, but if you comment, we can generally see the comments as they come up. We're on a different program, which enables us to be on multiple platforms. That being said, we're actually coming back in about a month. We're going to be back on with Ken Larsen, who's going to be able to have an open Q&A so that you guys can be on and actually ask questions directly. It'll be live to open. In this episodes over here, I'm bringing on different experts where I'm going to have one-on-one conversations and then following up with a live Q&A where you guys can come on board. That being said, Ken, let's talk about specific type of drawing, specific type of materials. How do we look at things when they're paper, when it's wood, when it's, all different sorts of things that we look at? What are the major ones that have stood out? And what has been the different ways of drawing it to get it to site? I know certain things we may have to take off site, certain things We're talking about the dwelling aspects. So let's put contents aside for a moment. Let's first talk about the dwelling. Is there a different type of dwellings that get dried differently?
Oh, heavens, yes. So imagine that you have a typical residential structure. It's a stick-built frame, so that means it's made with lumber, right? And you have sheetrock in there, and carpet, and cushion, and plywood, and particle board furniture and materials, and all kinds of building components that would be typical in a residential structure. Now you compare that to a commercial structure: concrete slab, steel stud, one layer of sheetrock, and pretty much metal furniture. Right now, the difference between these two buildings. I would like to introduce a word that somebody may or may not have heard of, or that your audience may or may not have heard of before. The word is called hygroscopic. Hygroscopic. Now, it is spelled H-Y-G as in George, R-O, hygroscopic. Now compare that to a hydroelectric dam, hydro with a D as in David. Hydroelectric dams, the generators are turned by liquid water. So hydro refers to water in a liquid phase. Hygro is also water, but it's when it's in a gas phase. So when we're talking about humidity, it is a hygro with a G scopic discussion. We're talking about a hygrometer. That's something that measures humidity. A hygroscopic is any substance that can react to changes in humidity. Things like paper, things like wood. Wood can absorb and release humidity, right? Things like gypsum wallboard, it can absorb and release humidity. It will react to changes in humidity. Now, let's compare the two buildings. A concrete structure with a little bit of sheetrock and metal furniture and metal studs. There's very little in there that can absorb humidity, compared to a residence that has all kinds of things that can react to changes in humidity. Now, what does that mean for us? Here's what it means for us as a restorer. There's a word for it. It's called oh man, I was just thinking about this the other day. It's called, it'll come to me. I'm sorry, when I think about it too hard, sometimes the word escapes me, but if I keep talking, we'll talk about the load that the building can absorb in humidity. If you have a little bit of water in a commercial structure that evaporates, there's nothing for the humidity to soak into. Okay, so humidity in a commercial building goes up in no time flat, because there's nothing for that humidity to soak into the building materials. Now, in a house, if you leave a residence humid for a day or two, you'll find that the humidity kind of comes down. Why? Because it's soaked into all the materials. And so now all the building materials are excessively wet just from having had a water intrusion that came into the residence and was left for a few days. And you sit there, well, where's the humidity? Well, it's soaked into the 2x4s. It's soaked into the plywood. It's soaked into the sheetrock. Okay, so the buildings react to differences in humidity quite demonstrably. You can actually predict it and watch it with some experience. You can say, oh, there's not a lot of hygroscopic materials here. The humidity is going to, it's going to get high real fast. We got to be on our game with the humidity control. So yeah, buildings are different. You have to approach them differently.
Yeah, I remember I was an electrician back in the day. I was working for an electrical company, and we did a few condos in Brooklyn in Borough Park. And I would go in to do, and it was an ice cold day, and it could have been, it could be hot today or yesterday. But when I would walk in and the structure is built with cement cinder blocks, even though, the main structure is held up with iron, with solid metal beams, and it's built with cinder blocks, and we would go in and we would be freezing. That no matter how hot it got during the day, it was ice cold in the building from the place just freezing from the day before and 2 days before. It's just because it was winter, and it was just so cold in there. And that's really what I'm understanding, where it doesn't have room to escape, to
So
change.
what you're describing, I think, is called thermal load. Okay, so you have cold bricks, and it takes a long time for the bricks to warm up. Even though there's warm air around it, that air, can I give you a little bit of science nerd stuff right now? Is that okay?
It's just okay with me.
So here's it. What is temperature? I mean, we know it feels hot outside, but what is that? Why does it feel warm on some days and colder on other days? What's hot? What's cold? Where is that sensation coming from? And the answer is, what we sense as temperature is the violence or speed with which water molecules are vibrating, or any substance is vibrating. If my desk feels hot, the molecules that make up that table are vibrating very, very, very fast. That is what we sense as hot. If they're vibrating slowly, that's what we sense as cold. Okay? And so there's we're talking about the average speed with which the molecules are shaking. That's what we sense as temperature. All right. With that in mind, your bricks that were cold from having survived a freezing event, okay, they're all cold. The only way they can warm up is through convection. Convection is heating by means of a fluid, whether it be a liquid or a gas. The material that is cold will come into contact with warm materials, the liquid or the gas will come into contact with the solid material, and the warm air that has fast vibrating molecules will come into contact with the cold brick, surrender that energy to the cold brick, thus making the molecules in the brick vibrate a little bit faster, and it becomes progressively warmer. Okay, that's thermal mass of the brick is so dense compared to the sparse density of the gases adjacent to it, that there has to be a lot of air that comes into contact with that brick in order to surrender its energy to make the brick warmer. It's going to take days for that brick to get warmer, because the thing that's warming it up is the sparsely dense air molecules that are coming into contact with that solid substance. And that's why it takes a long time. So with that thought in mind, for those of you who have had jobs where you're struggling to dry out a concrete slab, it's because the air in there is so sparsely dense with those molecules compared to all the molecules in the slab that have to be heated up. It takes days, even weeks, to get it to rise 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It is an extremely difficult thing to do, to warm up materials with warm air. It is the least efficient method of all the ways we can heat up a material. Trying to heat it with warm air is the least efficient heat delivery process of the three that we have to choose from. The three ways you can heat up a material is with convection, that's with a liquid or an air, or with conduction, that's a solid to a solid. Like take a hot clothes iron and put it on the brick. Solid to a solid. That's a very effective way of delivering thermal energy to the brick, but it's really hard to iron your whole building, right? That doesn't work. Okay. And then the other way that is the most efficient method to deliver thermal energy to a solid material is radiant heat. Because whatever that heat lamp is radiating upon, that will deliver the thermal energy to the surface upon which it shines without heating the air. Radiant heat goes right through air and will only deliver the thermal energy to the solid substance beyond it. Very cool. Radiant heat is a very efficient, very effective way of delivering thermal energy to a solid substance.
So, I mean, we're talking radiant heat when it comes to the gaps in between, in the structure walls, we still have to open up because we have another solid before the solid. So we still have to open up one solid, from my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, so radiant heat does not go through materials. The depth with which radiant heat will deliver its thermal energy, they actually measured it, and it's a ridiculously thin element of that solid substance. It's like 1/32 of an inch deep. I mean, it's very, 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 very thin layer of thermal energy being delivered there. Once the surface molecule of that solid substance starts shaking, it then shares it with its buddy right next to him. It says, oh, hey, you take some of this heat. And then that one says, well, hey, I've got too much too. Let's give it to the guy next to me. And it will then progressively transfer through the solid material where they're all sharing that thermal energy, and they collectively will eventually all have the same momentum, the same thermal energy between them. It's a slow process. It's called thermal bridging. When that temperature passes through a solid substance.
It's almost like the solid dries up, and that way the solid is drying the next part. Where it's almost the same.
Yeah.
Like,
don't confuse drying with temperature, though.
Understood.
But you got the idea. Is that the top layer gets that thermal energy, and then it shares that all the way through the substance. If there's a water molecule somewhere in that passage, that water molecule is going to start shaking really violently. And if it gets enough of that vibration, enough of that energy, so that it starts shaking really violently, it will start shaking so violently that it will break its magnetic bonds. There actually is a magnetic attraction between these molecules, and it will break the magnetic bonds, releasing itself from the solid material, becoming a sole water H2O molecule all by itself, not bonded to anything, shaking really fast, thus existing as a gas in this blend of gases of nitrogen and oxygen and all the other gases that we're breathing. It just becomes a component of that blend of gases that we call air, because it was given enough thermal energy in the solid substance so that it could break its magnetic bonds with the concrete or the wood and become a gas all on its own. I love this subject. It's just, once you can start to visualize it, then it becomes clear. I know what I got to do. I know why it's not drying. I know why this job dried faster than I expected, because you start to understand how you are delivering energy to the water molecule to inspire it to become a gas.
Now, we're going ahead and we're doing things over time with the stabilization mode, and sometimes it starts drying things naturally in that process. My understanding is that once you dry the process, if for some reason there's contaminants, it still has to then be leaked out, cleaned, and then dried again. Is that correct?
Okay, so I think we've got two subjects here that we are blending together.
We're blending together.
Let's assume that we had a job that was determined to be contaminated water. It soaked into sheetrock. Yes. And then the job, for some reason, had been delayed for unknown reasons. It sat there for weeks, maybe months. And now the sheetrock is dry. Is the sheetrock still a health risk to the occupants? Now, I've talked to a lot of microbiologists and a lot of toxicologists, and pretty much they all say the same thing. Dead bacteria, it does not generally, I hate sweeping comments, but generally speaking, they don't provide an immediate health risk. At least they haven't identified it. Now, there are some toxins that can be produced by bacteria called endotoxins and exotoxins. They're not to be confused with mold toxins called mycotoxins. They're different, okay? Now, when the bacteria is dead and no longer viable, those toxins can still be present. Even though the bacteria cannot germinate and it cannot reproduce, the toxin might still be present. So now the question is there sufficient toxin in that bacteria that would be inside the sheetrock to warrant its removal and replacement? I will confess that is a worthwhile debate, okay, because of what I just told you. I don't know if that is a legitimate reason to cut out sheetrock or materials. I am still looking for the justification for that. The bigger issue is this, is that inside that wall cavity behind the sheetrock, you still need to clean it. So now the sheetrock needs to be removed so that you can clean the structure. You need to clean the structure there, right? And so that can justify its replacement so that you can clean the balance of the structure. People shouldn't live in dirty homes, especially if that water was not theirs. It's not, it wasn't intended to be there. And
So
that is
what I'm hearing from you is, yes, that may be dry, but that does not mean that the walls internally are dry. And that does not mean that the damage that you see on the walls doesn't have to be removed. So there's still other things. And once again, that's maybe my conversation about pre-loss condition, not really, talking about your aspect. But basically what we're saying is there are so many different elements involved that really just because the surface is dry doesn't mean the internal surface is dry, doesn't mean everything else is not, doesn't have to be looked at.
That's right.
So it's just a starting point, but all the other factors are still may be relevant.
Right. And so here's where, and Penny, this is your world because you understand the language of the policy much better than I do. But when it says that we will pay for the resulting damages, the question is logically asked, if the water that came into the building was full of bacteria and the bacteria is now introduced into the living space, even though it's dead, is that damage?
Well,
I've got bacteria I don't want in there. Is that damage?
Let me ask you another question. That may be dead right now, but what if it gets wet? Does it become alive again?
So if it's dead, even though it becomes wet, it is no longer, it can't germinate, okay? There's a difference between germination and dead, as I understand it. So, I don't want to get too much into the microbiology discussion on this, but I believe that it's the issues with the spores that bacteria can produce, even though the bacteria might be dead, the spores might survive. Right?
So what we're saying is that the dirt is still there and can go into people's lungs, etc.
Right. Yeah.
So that place still needs, it may no longer need drying, but it still needs cleaning.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, if it was your home, and I invite all listeners to think about this, if it was your home and you had an insurance claim because water came into the house and somebody informed you that they tested the water and it was no longer fresh, then is it in fact part of, is that worthy of the claim coming, is that part of the claim that deserves to have it repaired? And that is, that's a worthwhile question. I know if it was my home, I'd want that contaminant out. Whether it's viable or not, it wasn't what I wanted in my house. And so in my values, I would really want to see that water, the residue addressed, physically washed, an application of an EPA registered disinfectant according to the label directions, and then rinse that foreign chemical from my house, that life-killing product, disinfectant. I don't want to live in a house that's got a life-killing product sprayed all over everything. I want you to get that life-killing product out. I want you to rinse it out along with all the dead microorganisms you just claimed to have killed. Don't you leave those carcasses in my house. You get those carcasses out of there. So I want it washed and I want it rinsed and then I want it dried.
Understood. So even though something may have dried naturally, it still needs to be completely dead. It still needs to be cleaned, and then once again dried again. So going through the process again.
And this is the thing. It's amazing how many of these consultants that are engaged by the insurance company, they, for some reason it takes weeks for the insurance company to dispatch the consultant to go take a look at the house. And by the time they get there, they bring out their trusty moisture meter and they put it on things and say, I can't find any water. I guess you got no claim. That's not the way it works. Remember that Mother Nature will dry out that building on its own, but it could be all nasty. And just because 3 weeks after the date of loss, the consultant comes in there and he says, I can't find any water here. You got no claim. That's not addressing the job properly. And so it's astonishing how many people think that as long as it's dry, you don't have a problem. You can't. That's not the way a claim is supposed to be processed. And that's not a fair settlement because if you had a covered peril, the scope of work deserves to be performed, whether they delayed long enough or not.
And this takes me back to so many claims where I've walked through and it's like, well, the place is dry. And it's like the key element to anything is documentation. This is why when I have a claim, I'm in there myself doing my own moisture meter readings, and why I have a infrared camera to document moisture or the elements of where I see that, some sort of documentation to show that there is moisture. Why, I'll get a call and I'll send my mitigation company right away and say, take my moisture readings. Let's see that happen. Now I don't care as much if they come 3 weeks later, because here's my readings. You may not have it. The insurance company may not have the readings, but here you go. I have documentation to facilitate and to give me reason why I have to take care of what I need to take care of.
Right.
And it really makes a documentation is a key element when it comes to. And there's so many times I was speaking to somebody yesterday and she's like, well, I just threw all that stuff out. I said, did you take pictures? I've been on a claim where it was in the Carolinas where she's like, well, everything was damaged. I just burnt it all.
Oh.
I took out the couch and I just burnt it. We had a nice bonfire. I'm like, great, but I can't claim anything for that.
And it's funny. That's one of the things I respond to a lot of hurricane zones, because I find that I get very busy on hurricane jobs when people need to have some assistance. And one of the things that I consistently see, and it's disappointing, is that you are driving through a residential community and there's all these houses and they have all their furniture in a massive heap sitting outside in the front yard. And there's people that are sifting through all of these contaminated, nasty, you don't want to ever own them or touch them with bare hands because they're nasty. They're very biological. Okay. You might as well be playing in poop. It's not I know you see a nice stainless steel fridge sitting out there on the street and you want to go and pick it up and, have a spare fridge, but they are nasty. Why would you put food in something that is as dirty as poop, right? It's not a smart move. And then, of course, they disappear. And so they make a claim and say, hey, by the way, I need a new stainless steel fridge. And the adjuster says, well, where is it? And he said, well, I threw it out. Well, I don't believe you ever had one. And that's the problem. And so here's the best bit of advice. If you ever have an insurance claim and you have contents that you believe are going to be part of the claim, never throw away the contents until you've been paid in full. You can remove them from the house. That's no problem. Put them in the backyard and cover them in a tarp and just leave them there. All right. But don't throw them away until the insurance company has given you a check for its value. And that's with everything, even wet toilet paper. Don't throw them out. They all have monetary value.
I love that statement because I tell clients over and over, the key, they ask me, well, am I going to get paid for this? Am I going to get paid for that? And I said, you're going to get paid when the check is cleared in your account. Until that money's in your account, don't throw out that pipe. I still need that broken pipe. What's the value of that pipe? That pipe is the value of your claim, period. And ongoingly, I'm like, yes, send me a picture. Yes, do that, but don't throw it out. I've had so many times where literally a hot water tank is sitting in the garden or in the garage, and the client actually listened to me. And when I come to the site, they're like, well, where is it? I'm like, there it is, right there. Right. And it makes a big difference because all they do is they snap pictures and they say, okay, that's fine. And then there are other times where it's not there, and they'll tell me over and over again, they say, oh, we want to do an inspection. Let me send you my inspector to actually test it. And I'm like, yeah, it's not there. I can't help. Right. And I'm at the point where if I don't have that thing, if I don't have that invoice, that report from the guy that's the plumber or the electrician, I won't file a claim. I'll sit there for a week or two on the claim without filing it because I'm not going to start when I can't do anything.
Right. Exactly.
And I tell the client, give me the stuff or I'm not starting. And this is a subject we can go on and on, but there's one thing that I really want to have a conversation with you about. You've brought up freeze drying. You've brought up, how to take care of proper paper. And I know this is something that we can have this conversation for a full day on all sorts of different things and never end. But I know you brought on freeze drying and different aspects in your book. Can you go into what is the best route to properly dry paper And obviously, when we look at documents, the key element I look at is, first of all, can we get rid of these documents? And sometimes, like we're dealing with in our job, where suddenly there's certain documents that have signatures on it that are priceless in certain ways, and we can't just throw them out. What is the best route to take care of these documents, and what are the different ways that you may be able to look at things and say, well, sometimes I'll have to do it this way, sometimes I have to do it that way? You want to talk about paper as a whole and what direction we should go?
It's really interesting that you go right from basic to almost the most sophisticated scientific study out there in drying, which is vacuum freeze drying. It's a very technical subject. But yes, we certainly can talk about that. So most drying in people's business involves, like when you're drying out a building, you're dealing with normal ambient conditions. You're not dealing with pressurizing the building and pumping air into the building or creating a vacuum in the building. We're not dealing with pressures at all. We are just merely drying the air, moving it around, and making sure that our materials are at the desired temperature in the drying process, and that there's no vapor barriers interfering with the process of the water leaving the material and entering the atmosphere. That's drying in a nutshell. Okay, that's pretty much how it's done. There is, however, methods that you can dry materials with that are dramatically influenced by the pressure that exists inside a chamber. I just noticed that my video froze up. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Even though my video, I don't like the look on my face there, but there it is. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do with the documents that have become wet. I'm just going to stop my camera and then start it again and see if that fixes it. That
didn't at the moment.
It's off and then on, and it is just not doing anything. Okay, sorry, my video froze. All right, let's talk quickly about documents. Here's the skinny on what to do with documents. I know that I've been talking a lot today, so I want to get right to the point. If you have wet documents, your first thing you should do with those wet documents is as soon as can be. I don't like my picture on that. It looks so bad. Anyways, the first thing you should do is take the documents, put them into a plastic bag, and freeze them into a solid block of ice. And I know that might be counterintuitive, but if you've got wet documents, I'm going to give you some examples of documents that you simply can't throw away. Legal documents, blueprints, city hall documents, dental records, doctor's office documents, a library, the Library of Congress. There are documents out there that are just enormously valuable, and you must preserve them. So the first thing you do is you freeze them into a block of ice and leave them frozen. You can leave them like that for weeks, months, years. They're not going to degrade. They're a block of ice. They can sit there all year long and it's not going to get moldy. Don't worry about them. If they're a block of ice, you're stable. And it takes very little to get that done. You just need to know that that's what you need to do. And then once they're frozen into a block of ice, you can make the decision on whether or not they're to be preserved and restored, or simply thrown away. Or you reproduce them. That's another method in which you can save the document. Let's say they're covered in sewage.
Ken, let's take a moment to deactivate your camera and leave it off for a few moments.
All right.
And then we'll bring it back. But what I'm hearing from you is that, and I really want to get your face back on here in working condition. What I'm hearing from you really is the factor that at the end of the day, when we have a camera, we do have a camera too. When we have a item that's frozen, that's and now I see you clearly. Thank you very much. When we have an item that got wet, when we have paper that got wet, and I hear the same is about electronics. I should say the video, the old file, the video or tapes, throw them in the freezer, get them to freeze so that it's not growing its damage. And I've had that. I've had first edition books that I've had on a Brooklyn property where I went ahead and then I called my guy and called my mitigation guy, my contents guy, and said, what am I supposed to do with this? I got to get this properly, and it's a first edition book. It's got to be properly handled. And they said, throw it in the freezer. And that's what I did. I threw it in the freezer until they were able to take it. And then, they picked it up, and I saw their place. It was an interesting dynamic where they, how they dry things. But it really makes a difference. And that's what you're basically telling us, freeze that so that the damage doesn't grow.
Now, I have in my book an entire section on specialty items like that and what you should do with them if you encounter them. Now, it's not coming from my thought process or my mind. I got this information from the National Archive of the United States. It's they have a chart on what you're supposed to do with many items that you might encounter. Things like a microfiche or movies. What do you do with these great big film reels, or photographic negatives or leather-bound books, right? So it's not like everything can just, freeze everything. If you froze a movie, like one of those big cellophane movie reels, the freezing process can crack and break that silver finish or whatever is on there that makes the image, and it can ruin the film. So in my book, there's guidance on what items you can freeze and those few items that you can't freeze and what you should do with them. Some of them you're supposed to leave wet. Make sure that they're sitting in a bath and just leave them wet. Don't freeze them. Don't expose them to air. Leave them wet. And so, it's good to know what those items are that you can restore and what you can't. Now, just finishing up with that freeze drying process. If you have a frozen book or frozen records, written records, you can then get they call them a refrigeration truck, a semi-truck's trailer that has a refrigeration unit on it, where they normally, transport fruits and vegetables, right?
Right.
You can get a reefer. It's a reefer. It's a trailer that can have frozen contents and maintain it frozen. And then you can deliver it to one of there's probably 3 or 4 vacuum freeze drying facilities for this purpose in the United States. And one of them is in Fort Worth or Weatherford, Texas. That's the one I typically refer. There's another one in Quebec. There's a mobile unit that actually can drive around. I've heard mixed reviews of that service. But there's a variety of locations that have these massive chambers about the size of a semi-truck trailer. Okay. They're about 60 or 70 feet long, 10 feet high, 10 feet wide, and 1/2-inch corrugated steel. I mean, they are a really thick steel chamber. And then they can produce massive vacuums almost equivalent to outer space. Okay, like there's no air in there, none. They just suck it all out. And through that process, you can make the frozen book, the ice in the frozen book, boil, because it's in a chamber that is such a massive vacuum that the water in an ice phase will start to boil. And it will go straight from a solid, the water will go straight from a solid, ice, to a gas phase and completely miss the liquid phase. And the atmospheric condition has to be just right in order for that to happen. It's called triple point. It's the point at which water can exist in a solid, liquid, and gas phase all at the same time. And it's perfectly comfortable in all 3 phases. So when you create a strong enough vacuum, you can make an ice cube boil and it will never see the liquid phase. It's a fascinating subject, and it's incredibly effective. It is way, way, way more effective than simply taking your book and putting it in a freezer, not in a plastic bag, but just put it in the freezer, and then let's come back and look at it in a year and see if it's dry by now, because the sublimation process will happen. It'll go from a solid to a gas, but extraordinarily slowly. Like it'll take a year, but it can work. So the way you accelerate that is you put it in a massive vacuum chamber, and that can complete the sublimation process in a mere week or 10 days. Now, just so you know what the end result will be, the book will still have all the pages all wavy, and it'll be a fat, swollen book. You know what a wet document sometimes looks like, right? It's all kind of wavy, and it's not square and flat anymore. You can return it to its flat condition, but you quite literally have to have somebody sit there at a table with a clothes iron and iron each page. Turn the page, iron the next one, turn the page. And you have to go through the process to iron these pages in order to make it flat again. And then you've got the water stains that will still be on the book. It'll be dry now, but you still got that brown water stain on every page. So how do you get the brown stain out? There's tricks to that. You have to sit there with a Q-tip and the correct solution to go draw on every one of those brown pages and bleach the water stain off of each page. So drying the document's not the expensive part. I've heard, between $100 and $200 per cubic foot to dry out the documents, but they all look like heck. They're dry, but they're all distorted and discolored. The real money is in getting that stain off the page and making them flat. And that can, it depends on the document. It's going to cost money. About 30 years ago, I restored 3 Bibles that were from the 1700s. And, 30 years ago, my cost for that service was $3,000. So I think today it would be much closer to $10,000 or $15,000 to restore those 3 Bibles from the 1700s.
So what I'm hearing from you is that this is a much better way of drying out the equipment. It gets less damage, but the damage is still there. And it can
you mean the books, the documents.
The documents, yeah. Talking about documents and the damage. So it's still going to go through that process, even though it goes through a lot quicker. It'll slow down the process and prevent some of it, but it's still going to have the stains and that. But that freeze drying. But that freeze drying solution is really taking it from frozen to dry state. But we're still going to have damage from it being wet in the middle, is what you're saying.
Not being wet in the middle. So this is the beautiful part of vacuum freeze drying. When you put that document, that frozen book, into a massive vacuum chamber, even the center of the book, where, right in the center of the page, middle of the book, it's also subjected to that vacuum chamber. And even the center of the book will boil. So it's not just the perimeter. It's the whole book boils, even in the center of the core.
So the difference between the different elements, between a regular drying process versus a freeze drying process, is when you freeze dry a process, you're going through a vacuum chamber, and it's not as slow as a process. The entire book is going to dry from top to bottom, versus it's slowly working like the drying process where we were talking about before where the sheetrock just dries at the end and slowly reverberates. Over here, we're not reverberating. The entire book is being dried at once, which also means, in essence, that the book is not going to be, it may have a wave in it just if it's not sitting still in the process. But a wave is going to be less because the book is sitting flat, and that line is going to be a lot better than it would in the regular process.
Absolutely.
So yes, you may have a dry. Yes, you may have the damages of a drying process, but it's not going to be close to what it would be in a regular process. So therefore, in essence, long term, if it's an expensive item, it'll actually be cheaper to clean if you go through the vacuum process, the freeze dry process. In the long term, it's actually cheaper to repair because there's less physical damage to the book.
Absolutely.
The documents.
So with its traditional drying process with dehumidifiers and air movements and stuff, you're only drying from the surface exposed to the atmosphere, right? That's where the transition happens. It's the surface to the dry atmosphere. That's where the water moves.
Right.
In a vacuum chamber, the whole chamber is subject, and even the center of the book is in that vacuum. And therefore the center, everywhere in the entire document, it's boiling. The whole thing, because it's all subject to that vacuum. And that's what causes the water to change from a solid to a gas. It's because it's in a super strong vacuum.
See, my alarms keep ringing. I'm supposed to be taking my remedies and whatnot. Yeah, I'm supposed to take my remedies, so we'll get to them. No rush. That's what happens when you take homeopathic. It changes your life in many essence. When you're looking at things, it changes how you look at things.
Yeah.
In any case, we're gone through, and we can talk on this subject forever. And we've spoken about the dwelling. We've spoken about where you've gone to really. I mean, you've been through it all in so many different aspects of this job of understanding what the drying aspect, from the restoration to where you are now, a consultant coming in for high-end, beautiful jobs. I know we're working on this beautiful job together. That's very, very interesting and very in depth. And it goes, and now we're talking about freeze drying. When you were talking, and I know Bruce actually commented about the that you've brought on textiles and acknowledged textiles and how we're looking at things so differently, and really every single item is interacting differently. And I don't know if you see the comments, but that's they pop up in their own picture there. And it really, everything that we look at is so different and has its own case. I mean, you've brought up the factor that you've looked at the records and you've brought into your book how to dry things differently. And it's not just, just freeze it. It's different depending on the type of materials that it is and how to deal with it. And it really makes a difference on so many different things. So yeah, it really is. But having had this conversation, I do want to point out that next month it'll be posted again. I believe it's the 14th. Let me look back over here. On the 17th of August at 12 o'clock, we're going to have we're scheduled to have a live session where we're going to be open to the public for Q&A, and we'll have that posted in the links for people to join. But it's really going to, I mean, this conversation is just a start to really anybody who really wants to understand and learn what it's about to really properly put something into a stabilization mode, really. Because when something that gets damaged, a few reasons we have to stabilize things, and you'll probably bring on some more reasons. But number one, to stabilize gives the insurance company an opportunity to inspect it. Number two, there may be things that we can't just pull out, and we may have to stabilize it, whether it's the contents that now has to be taken out of the property properly, and then whether it's other damaging aspects such as asbestos, lead, or other things in the walls where we can't just rip it out just because we want to rip it out. It has to be taken care of properly. So there may be a variety of reasons why we have to stabilize the property. And that's step number one. And then step number two is now how do we dry it, and having a drying plan to take care of it properly by, number one, removing the toxins or anything that's in the water, any damaging effect. And then number two, actually drying the property back to pre-loss condition. And I know you're going to say, well, that's my field. Yes, but it's all about pre-loss. It's all about getting it to where it was before the damage happened. Anything else?
In fact, I would like to invite your listeners to bring their favorite common subject of debate. So if you are an adjuster or a contractor that is listening to this feed, and you are tired of a common argument that you're consistently facing. So I'll give you an example. Some contractors and even adjusters or insurance claims reps believe that buildings can be dried in 3 days. And therefore, we just want to pay for 3 days of drying. That's all it needs to be done. 3 days is enough. Or 4 days, or 5 days, or 2 days, whatever your magic number is. That's a common argument. I'd be really interested in exploring that discussion with your listeners. because that is a ridiculous threshold. It has a long history. It is a complete falsehood. And the laws of physics do not comply with the wishes of an insurance carrier. It doesn't work that way. So, we can talk about strategies and sources where you can actually reference in order to try and, counter their suggestion that everything should be dried in 3 days. Or any other common debate, whatever it might be. We don't allow for that or something, those types of comments. Or that's your overhead. That's not an expense to the job. That's just your overhead. You have to absorb that. Or documentation challenges. We all have challenges with that. Or third-party reviewers that show up on the job after the work is done and then want to argue what you did on the job. Now, the only thing that we all have to be really careful of is that we can't drop the names of the individuals or the companies that they work for in that kind of a discussion. We must speak in generalities and without mentioning names, especially on a feed like this. I'm sure everybody understands that. So if you want to talk about the issue, I'd be really excited to explore those discussions with you. I might have some good information for you, but I'm still trying to figure things out like everybody else is. I mean, let's face it, it's a very challenging insurance claim market right now. It's not easy. And so it's good when we can lean on each other and try and see if we can help each other out.
Well, yeah, this is unbelievable. And August 17th, we're going to have a Zoom at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And yes, it's 2022. And we're going to have that Zoom. So it's going to be open to two people within the industry that would like to join. You can email me; it's on the bottom, Claim a Balance PA, or you can comment, or the links will be live; it will be available. And I believe it's August 17th at 12 noon that we have scheduled in about a month, where Ken will be back on with us, answering those questions and helping us deal with any, all these situations. You can also comment on whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you're watching this. You can comment, and we can revisit it when we're back on live at that time. So thank you very much for everybody who's watching, whether you're watching the live or watching the rerun. Thank you very much for watching. And Ken, thank you very much for joining us over here for this last hour and a half conversation that I know we can continue ongoingly without debate, but I really, I think we've covered a lot of different subjects, and we'll join again to do this, to be open and available for the many questions that are going to come on. Thank you again, and looking forward to seeing everybody.
Sounds good. See you later, everybody. Bye-bye, Kenny.